What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we have a fun one. We are going over some of the top draft day mistakes. There is not going to be player analysis in this video, but I did include some tips that I have not mentioned in previous seasons. Definitely some tips for some of you experts out there, and even if you are well aware of all of these mistakes and the advice, if you stay tuned until the end, I went over some early and late round running backs and receivers and bumped them up against the ADP on various platforms to let you know which players are coming in at the best values, so you can know if you should be targeting them earlier or later depending on where you're drafting. I will leave a timestamp for that in the description box below. But before we do get into that, we have to go over the stat of the day. Yesterday's stat of the day was which quarterback since 2017 has compiled the most fantasy points at the position. The correct answer was Russell Wilson. Congratulations to Sean Kelly, you got this one right. As for today's stat of the day, of wide receivers with 75 or more targets in 2019, which wideout faced the highest percentage of double coverage? Leave your answer in the comment section down below. We'll be happy to let you know who wins in tomorrow's video. Also, guys, if you have not yet drafted, consider signing up for our draft package. You'll have access to our tier-based rankings, our sleepers, targets, busts. We have player breakdowns on all draftable players, risk ratings, consistency charts, offensive line rankings, and more. So if that interests you, go to our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com, link as always in the description box below. With that out of the way though, let's hop into the first mistake, and this one is just more of a PSA. I know sometimes it's out of our own control, but do whatever you can to draft as late as possible, as close to the start of the season as you possibly can. We have seen recently in the past week, players' values in ADPs, they've changed dramatically just on one single news blurb. A prime example is Joe Mixon, who was a first round pick throughout the entire offseason, presumably a workhorse running back on an ascending offense led by a quarterback that was arguably the most talented they've had at the position for several years now. Well, news did come out that he was dealing with migraines, he had not been on the field practicing, at least not with pads, and due to the contract ambiguity, his ADP, it fell dramatically. From being a first round pick for the entire offseason, he fell about a round and a half. He was able to be drafted in the back of the second, sometimes even falling into the third. Now that didn't last long. As we know, Joe Mixon did sign a pretty massive contract, and that did instantly boost his ADP again. Now we're seeing a similar situation with Alvin Kamara, who is also in a contract negotiation himself. The New Orleans Saints have already come out and said that they're possibly willing to trade him, so we're going to see a dip in his ADP as well. The issue with that though is we don't know if in a week from now, prior to the start of the actual season, if this is even going to be a concern. Someone is either going to have to take the risk in drafting him, maybe wasting a second round pick on Alvin Kamara, a player with a ton of talent, but if he holds out, if he doesn't see the field, or if he's traded to a worse offense, it's a gamble that you probably shouldn't really take. All of these risks can easily be avoided though. All we have to do is have our fantasy drafts as close to the actual start of the NFL season as we possibly can, because at least by that time, we'll have a clear understanding of all the players and their injury status, so we can make informed decisions on whether we want to take the risk in drafting that player or not, rather than taking shots on players we're guessing about based on educated guesses on third, fourth, or fifth party information available. The next draft day mistake we have is just not being aware of your targets and avoids. Whenever we're going into a fantasy draft, we should have not only our tier-based rankings, but we should outline players at every stage of the draft that we are targeting, the ones that ideally we would want on every one of our teams, and players that we would avoid just based off where they're currently going in drafts. Now, a lot of people get caught up in the mistake of grouping too many players at the same position, and when it comes to making a decision on draft day, when you're left with 3-4 options, you may not know which one you want to take over the other. For example, a really tough decision point for many people in the early to middle rounds is deciding between players like DK Metcalf, Terry McLaurin, or DJ Chark. Each player arguably has plenty of upside, different levels of safety, and they're all in completely different offenses, so not knowing exactly which player you would target in that position could put you in a tough pinch on draft day. The most accurate way to rank these players and decide which is the right fit for your team, assuming all three are targets, is going to be by fully understanding a player's range of outcomes. Each season you hear these words thrown around like ceiling, floor, And while those terms have become staple vocab in the industry, they are very important when it comes to who we're drafting. This isn't best ball. We're not just trying to stack up on as many players with the most upside as possible. Every choice, we have to factor in a player's risk, safety, upside, and the likeliness that they will hit the high end of their production, and the percentage chance that you believe that they will hit the low end of their production. The high end being the ceiling and the low end being the floor. Why exactly this is so important is because while we do want to draft the best player available at every spot we can, our overall goal, it's actually to be constructing a roster. You can't construct a roster if it is heavily weighted in one side, that being all safe players that are lacking that upside, or all upside players that are lacking that floor. If you have a team that has too many players with a high amount of upside, the odds are you're going to be assuming too much risk. If you go for too many players with a safe floor, the opposite can happen. If you're matched up against a team that does have that ability to pop off, your team just may not have the potential to put up the points needed to win that matchup. And in the fantasy playoffs, we're going to be competing against the best teams in the league. These teams that have made it this far in the league, they have that combination of safety and upside, or else they wouldn't have made it this far into the playoffs. When you're confident in a player's range of outcomes, you won't be forced with decisions in which you feel split. You should feel confident on draft day on which player you would take over the next. You should be well aware of that prior to heading into the draft, so that when the money is on the line, you aren't put in those tough decisions, making choices that you don't feel confident in. When we are faced with those decisions that we feel split over, a lot of people cop out to things that are pretty much irrelevant, things like bye weeks, and I know a lot of people will disagree with that. I know there are a large portion of people out there that will use bye week as a potential tiebreaker, but you should never really be put in a position where something as meaningless as a bye week is going to overall impact your decision. If we're exiting the draft and 6 players on our roster have a week 9 bye, I'm still completely fine with that. We don't know what our roster will look like by 9 weeks into the season, especially with COVID going on and the injuries that we've already sustained, and there hasn't even been any preseason games. Through 9 weeks of the NFL season, our rosters, based on what we do through waiver transactions and trades, it's going to look vastly different than what we leave with on draft day. One other major advantage that a lot of people don't consider when preparing for their draft is to take advantage of the historical data you have on a league that you've been in for several years. Go through your email. It will list you the live draft results based on the past 2, 3, 4 seasons, however long you've been in the league. And if this is a long-running family league, a home league, a work league, you're going to have these same people, maybe with a few different names here and there, and you're going to have some data that most of your other league mates aren't really looking into. You'd be surprised at the trends you can gauge from that. Some people will always target quarterbacks early. Others, you can see if they go wide receiver heavy, target the same players year over year. And any information you're able to gather, you will be able to use that to your advantage. You will be surprised at exactly how much information you can gather and use that to your advantage on draft day. And a lot of people, they don't even consider doing that. We always stress in many videos throughout the offseason that knowing your league is very important. We can tell you where we think players are going at good values at the tight end and quarterback position, but if the top 15 quarterbacks are all being drafted in the first 6 rounds, then we would definitely suggest to draft a quarterback earlier. With each fantasy season being 1 year split apart, oftentimes recency bias plays a major factor, but when we take a step back, look at the past 2-3 seasons and analyze what the trends are within our own leagues, we can have a better understanding on how we should approach the draft and tackle and use this information to our benefit. The final and arguably most important mistake people make on draft day is not fully understanding the ADP. Now, ADP is very reliant on the platform you're drafting on, and I'll get into some examples of players that we're targeting, but first let's talk a bit about the ADP. Even when we're going through our players we're targeting and players we're avoiding, the most important factor is what they cost for us to get them on our team. We may not like players that are going in the 3rd or the 4th round, but if they fall far enough to the 4th, maybe the 5th round where we actually feel comfortable taking them, where we have them ranked, then a player we're avoiding can instantly transform into a great value. The best way to feel confident that you know the ADPs of the players and where they should be going is, of course, know your league. Like I said, ADP can be completely thrown out the window, especially in live drafts, most drafts due to COVID are going to be online, but with online, the ADP plays a major factor because the online draft board, it does suggest which player you should take next. If your time runs out, it's going to draft the player with the highest projected ADP. And when looking at that across all of the different platforms, they are vastly different. If you're doing all of your mock drafts on Sleeper, but your actual fantasy draft is on ESPN, you are going to be a fish out of water. Players that you think are going at a certain stage of the draft may not be available, whereas you could also be missing out on value or drafting players higher than you need to just because their ADP may be projected for several rounds later. The first example of an early round running back that we're targeting heavily is James Conner of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, we have him ranked as the 15th running back off the board, and as you can see, the ADP on both Yahoo and Sleeper are right in line with our ranking, the running back 15. Now, we would still be more than happy to draft him at that spot because that's where we have him ranked, and him being a target, we're definitely happy getting him where we have him ranked. But if you're drafting on ESPN, you can see there is much more value. Now, 5 spots may not seem like a massive discrepancy, but when we're talking in the early rounds, 5 spots is the difference between landing a player and missing out on them. I can guarantee you players with certain draft spots may not even have the ability to get James Conner in both Sleeper and Yahoo, but if they're drafting on ESPN, they may have that option available to them. Now moving on over to an early round wide receiver we're targeting heavily, it's Robert Woods, and as you can see, unlike with James Conner, ESPN is not where the best value comes in. We actually have a better value on Yahoo, and while all 3 platforms do have him ranked lower than where we would take him, if we're trying to maximize our value, we do have the potential to draft him maybe a round or half a round later than we typically could if we're drafting off of ESPN or Sleeper. With these early round players though, we're talking a mere 5-6 spots difference, but let's go over to some later round guys. This is where you can really maximize value by even avoiding reaching on these players by a potential round or 2. Let's take a look at Anthony Miller at the wide receiver position. We are definitely higher than consensus on Anthony Miller. We have him ranked as the wide receiver 38. Now, the platform with the closest ranking is Sleeper, which is still coming in at a 12 spot value, coming in at the wide receiver 50. One thing is for sure that if you don't pull the trigger earlier than his ADP, you will be at risk of potentially losing out on the pick, but with 12 wide receivers separating our ranking and where he's currently projected to go in drafts, there is still a strong chance and a more likely chance that you can draft him much later than the wide receiver 38. While it is of course always a gamble, it is 100% a possible outcome. If you're drafting on ESPN or Yahoo, you would be a fool to take Anthony Miller at the wide receiver 38. Even if we have him ranked there, there is almost a virtual guarantee we can get him much later than that. As for a late round running back example, we have one of our favorite picks in the draft. It's Zach Moss. And this is a good example where you're not really going to have a major discrepancy amongst all 3 of the platforms. Obviously, they are differing by a handful of picks between each platform, but if you want to land Zach Moss, this is a player you're potentially going to have to reach for. If you weren't doing the research in advance on your specific platform and knowing where the ADP lands, how are you going to know when you have to pull the trigger on Zach Moss or risk losing out on him? So the biggest mistake people can make in drafts is by not doing enough mocks on the specific platform, not understanding the ADP and how to take advantage of that. Don't fall into that trap. You're better than that. But guys, that's gonna do it for this video. We really hope you enjoyed. If you did, how about hitting that like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.